Rain hammered the windows so hard it sounded like the sky was trying to break into the house. The old suburban home sat in darkness except for the occasional flicker of emergency lights, the kind that made every shadow look alive. Outside, streets were already turning into shallow rivers. Most families had locked themselves in, safe and warm. This house, however, had something else going on entirely, something uglier than the storm. The little girl stood near the hallway, hugging a thin sweater around her small frame. She was only 8, tired from the long day and confused by the tension that had been building for hours. Her mother was away on a work trip, and her father was somewhere she didn't fully understand. Work duties, they always said. So she had been left with her grandparents, people who smiled politely in front of others but never seemed warm when no one was watching. It started with something stupid. A glass of water tipped over. That was all. A harmless accident, easily fixed, something any adult could clean in 10 seconds. But the grandmother's voice snapped through the room like a whip, sharp and humiliating. Then the grandfather joined in, louder, angrier, as if the spilled water had insulted their entire bloodline. Words escalated into shouting. Shouting turned into punishment threats. And then, in a moment of bizarre pride and uncontrolled anger, they did something unthinkable. They dragged the child to the door. Not gently. Not carefully. They opened it to the storm outside and told her to stand there and learn. At first, it felt like a threat they wouldn't follow through on. But then the door closed. The lock clicked. And the sound of the storm rushed in like a beast swallowing her whole. She stood outside, shaking, rain soaking her hair within seconds, small hands pressing against the glass as she tried to understand what she had done wrong. Inside, the grandparents argued briefly, then settled into a twisted sense of justification. Her father is nothing, the grandfather muttered. Just military police paperwork. No real power. No consequences. They believed it. That was the worst part. Far away, in a quiet, undisclosed facility, a single alert triggered on a secured device. A man paused mid-report. The screen flashed once. Then again. Dependent exposed. Severe weather. Hostile domestic action confirmed. He didn't ask questions. He didn't raise his voice. He simply closed the file in front of him, straightened his posture, and stood up. The room felt suddenly smaller. Understood, he said calmly, as if accepting a routine update. But his eyes told a different story. Something had just changed. The rain hadn't eased by the time the black vehicle rolled into the edge of the neighborhood. No sirens, no flashing lights, just a low, steady presence of something that didn't need to announce itself. It stopped a few houses down, where the floodwater was shallow enough for boots to touch ground without hesitation. He stepped out slowly. There was no urgency in his movement, which somehow made it more unsettling. The storm clung to his uniform, but he didn't react to it. His focus was already forward, already calculating. Years of military police conditioning didn't just train reactions, it trained silence. The kind of silence that made people uncomfortable because it felt like being measured. His first stop wasn't the house. It was the gate. The child was still there. Small, trembling, soaked through, trying to stay upright against wind that didn't care how young she was. When he saw her, everything in his expression softened, but only for a second. Then the discipline returned, locking emotion behind procedure. He removed his jacket without hesitation and wrapped it around her, lifting her into his arms like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her hands clutched his shoulder instantly, not questioning, just holding on like she had been waiting for this exact moment to exist. "You're safe," he said quietly. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just certain. Inside the house, movement began. Curtains shifted. Shadows of 2 older figures appeared behind glass, watching. Confused at first. Then irritated. Then slightly nervous, though they would never admit it. The grandparents assumed he had come to argue. To beg. Maybe to apologize for overreacting to their discipline. That misunderstanding lasted until he pulled out his phone. Not to call them. To record. He walked calmly toward the house, each step deliberate, each action documented. A small device clicked softly as he captured timestamps, environmental conditions, and visual confirmation of entry points. It wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. That was what made it worse. When he finally reached the door, he didn't knock. He simply looked at it for a moment, then spoke in a tone that carried no anger, only authority shaped by structure. "Good evening," he said. "This residence is now under preliminary review for endangerment of a protected dependent." The grandfather opened the door immediately, already defensive. The grandmother followed, arms crossed, trying to reclaim dominance through posture alone. "This is a misunderstanding," the grandfather snapped. "She was outside for a minute." The man nodded once, as if noting a data point. "Understood," he replied. Then he raised his phone slightly. "And this is where documentation begins." By morning, the neighborhood no longer felt like a neighborhood. It felt like a paused world. Unmarked vehicles lined the streets with quiet precision, positioned in a way that made every exit visible and every movement accounted for. Floodwater had receded slightly, but the tension had risen in its place. People peeked through curtains, whispering, guessing, overreacting in the only way civilians know how, by imagining the worst possible explanation. The grandparents, however, were already in full damage control mode. At first, they insisted nothing serious had happened. Then they shifted to, "It was a misunderstanding." Then, "The child left on her own." Then, strangely, they began arguing with each other in the living room, each trying to avoid being the one officially responsible. Every sentence contradicted the last, and none of them matched the evidence quietly being compiled outside. The father remained calm through all of it. Too calm, in fact. He sat at the edge of the house like a man attending a scheduled briefing, occasionally responding to officers who came and went with reports. Cameras from the surrounding area had already been requested under formal authority. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Everything was done through paperwork, permissions, and quiet confirmations that somehow felt more intimidating than shouting ever could. A mayor arrived halfway through the morning, clearly unprepared for the scale of what he was stepping into. He tried to smile, tried to ask polite questions, but every answer he received only made him more uncertain. Why were there surveillance requests? Why were military police units involved in a domestic household issue? Why was no one explaining it in simple terms? No one could, because it wasn't simple anymore. Even the neighbors, usually eager to gossip, had gone unusually quiet. Not because they didn't want to talk, but because they realized they might be asked to. Inside the house, the grandparents attempted one last strategy: performance innocence. The grandmother repeatedly insisted she had only corrected behavior, while the grandfather tried to reframe everything as discipline within family rights. But every claim was calmly countered by timestamps, recorded footage requests, and witness statements already being collected. At one point, a junior officer politely asked them to clarify the timeline again. The way he asked it sounded harmless. But the moment they tried to adjust their story, he simply noted it down. No reaction. No judgment. Just another inconsistency logged. That was when panic started creeping in properly. Because they realized something uncomfortable. No one here was arguing with them. They were just recording them. The father finally stood once, not dramatically, not angrily. Just once, like someone closing a chapter. He looked at them briefly and said, almost casually, "Every version you've provided will be attached to the report. Please continue." That was the moment the grandparents stopped feeling powerful and started feeling documented. By the time the formal review was called inside the same house, the atmosphere had completely changed. What used to feel like a family living room now felt like a temporary administrative site where every object had lost its warmth. Even the furniture seemed out of place, like it was witnessing something it was never designed to understand. The grandparents sat rigidly on one side of the room, their earlier confidence drained into awkward silence. Every attempt they made to speak now came out slower, carefully measured, as if words themselves could be used as evidence against them. The realization had fully settled in. This was no longer about a discipline argument. It was a controlled procedural investigation, and they were not in control of the narrative anymore. The father remained calm throughout, seated across from them with a stack of neatly organized files and a device that quietly updated with incoming confirmations. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. Every statement he made carried the weight of finalized documentation behind it. The daughter sat close beside him, wrapped in a blanket, finally warm again. Every so often she would glance up at him, as if checking whether the storm outside had truly ended. Each time, he would respond with a small nod, the kind that didn't require explanation. A formal officer read out the summary in neutral tone. Weather exposure. Forced displacement. Verified CCTV absence during critical conditions. Contradictory statements from involved parties. Each point landed heavier than the last, not because it was emotional, but because it was precise. The mayor, still present, looked increasingly like he wished he had never attended anything that morning. He tried once to interject with community context, but the officer politely continued reading, as if the interruption had been noted and automatically set aside. Then came the part that changed the room's entire emotional temperature. Corrective measures. No arrests. No shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Just structured accountability. Mandatory written apology. Supervised family evaluation sessions. Behavioral review under civil observation guidelines. Community service assignments approved under oversight protocols. It wasn't violent. It was worse for them. It was organized consequence. The grandmother blinked repeatedly, as if expecting someone to finally say it was a joke. The grandfather opened his mouth once, then closed it again when he realized nothing he said would improve anything. Outside, the storm had fully passed. Sunlight started breaking through clouds, quietly exposing how normal the world still looked despite what had happened inside one house. The father finally stood again, holding his daughter's hand. He looked at them, not with anger, but with complete finality. "You didn't lose an argument," he said calmly. "You initiated a process you didn't understand." Then he turned slightly toward the door. And as he walked out with his daughter, the only sound left in the room was paper being arranged into its final, unavoidable order.